Before we get into this episode, let me tell you what to expect. So, our guest, Nicole Mason, and I, we dive deeply into her experience working in a complementarian faith space in the past. And complementarian, by that we mean a space that believes women should not hold certain leadership roles. Nicole shares beautifully and tenderly about her experience in that faith space. I feel so honored that she'd choose to be that open and generous on our show. We also talk about her work planting new churches, both in traditional church models and also in a very different model that she's doing now that centers the deep, sacred, and very real human connection of a small group of humans who have committed to each other faithfully. So this episode is somehow about the future of faith communities. It's about the heavy weight carried around by so many women within the context of religious institutions. It's about innovative church life and really so much more. It's a bit of a longer episode, but I didn't want to edit it because the whole thing felt so beautiful and sacred. Hey, I'm so glad you're here. Hey, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Between podcast that we made just for you. This is your host, Matt Mattson. I'm not sure if you've got your earbuds in or if you're in your car, or I don't know, maybe you're, in your kitchen, or maybe you're at work. Wherever you are, I want you to know you're welcome here. You are celebrated here. You are adored here. And we are just so glad you're listening. I got a special guest today. Nicole Mason is our guest. Nicole, what's up?
Hi, I'm literally about to tear up just at your intro.
Oh, that's nice.
That was so relaxing and it felt like a hug of an
Oh, that's
introduction.
really nice.
That was so wonderful. I'm already so excited to be here,
I
clearly.
tried to turn on my soothing voice, my loving voice. I'll tell you what, though, isn't it like how many rooms do people walk into and don't feel, or let's reverse that. Let's live on the positive side of the coin for a minute. Man, I want to walk into rooms where people's just like open up and open their arms wide and say, "Oh, I'm so glad you are here." I just feel like that is such a simple thing that I want more of in my life. Do you have rooms like that you walk into, Nicole, or are there moments, are there people like that make you feel
I
that
gotta
way?
say, my husband is
Yeah.
that in the most envious way
Yeah.
I'm like a freaking chihuahua. Like
Mhm.
I get too excited and I'm basically shaking. I'm like, oh my God, I'm so happy you're here. And I've had to learn that's not exactly welcoming to
Uh,
a whole demographic of people. That's a
uh-huh.
little much. So so I have learned a lot from my husband of what it means to like provide and make this safe and calm and just welcoming place that isn't necessarily super extroverted or super in your face. And kind of like, again, that's why I just enjoyed your intro so much. Just slow and you
Yeah.
can take a breath. And everything feels like you have to fill the silence and immediately respond. Like you get time to think and just process. Like that is one of his gifts, 100%. And it is 100% one of the reasons I think we are together.
Yeah. That's funny. That's
We need the
funny.
balance.
That's an important balance that you found in your life. And what a wonderful thing to say about him.
He's
Uh,
pretty great.
that's cool.
I
All right,
love
let
him.
me formally introduce you to our listeners. Nicole Mason, you are a church planter, you're a writer, you are an innovative Christian. Nicole has spent, for our listeners' sake, it's important to say, Nicole has spent 7 years in vocational ministry within complementary. Excuse me, I'm going to say that again. Here I am stumbling on your
Big
bio.
word.
All right, here we go. We're going to leave all this in, by the way.
Yes.
Nicole spent 7 years in vocational ministry within complementarian spaces and then left that world. She now leads a non-traditional, non-Sunday-centric church community in Houston, Texas. Nicole, for our listeners, Nicole is one of those voices that I just sort of bumped into on social media that I am just enthralled by. Everything you post, I'm like eating it up. I love it. And I think it's because you're in a different life stage than me. You're doing faith differently than me. You show up with an energy and an optimism that is just enchanting, honestly, Nicole. I want to talk about that optimism for a second. Um, I'm guessing it might have been born out of some painful experiences you've had in faith communities in the past. But I want to know what makes you optimistic about the way we can gather together to explore faith.
Yeah, those were really kind words. And yeah, I think even viewing myself as someone who is optimistic and hopeful, that is actually a very new
Hmm.
quality to perceive myself as, and it's come a lot because of the work that I'm currently doing. I would say that is like 9 times out of 10 people's number one question or response is how have you stayed hopeful, or
Yeah.
how do you stay positive? And again, I find it hard to answer because that's just not the narrative I have of myself in my head. I think in large part because I existed in these complementarian spaces for so long, um, that optimism and sort of hope for what we can be and what is possible and what we are capable of is not read as optimism. It's read as negativity,
Yeah.
and it's read as kind of annoying
Mhm.
and sort of just getting in the way of what we really want to do or what we're really about or what we're really going after. And so I think existing on this side of those spaces, getting to actually acknowledge that that hope and that tenacity and that probably idealism on some days has never been a bad thing, even if it wasn't always received well,
Yeah.
and that it's actually a really good thing, especially for the line of work I am now in. But I do think that's sort of where a lot of that was born, was in those spaces where my optimism and my hope, it didn't really get to come from a stage. It didn't really get to come from, even like sermons or worship sets. Like that was definitely not where I felt the most hope or excitement for the church. It was in the most just segregated, off to the side, forgotten about spaces with largely teenage girls,
Mhm.
sitting on the floor having conversations about their first heartbreak or about, jealousy or about just the world of a 16-year-old female.
Mhm.
And it was in those spaces that I saw hope for the church. It was in
Mhm.
those spaces that I felt the most just present with God and in the midst of his work and in the midst of what he was doing in people's lives. And that's where I fell in love with ministry. I mean, that's where that love for the church got solidified. And so I think when that is where the love of church and faith and religion and God is formed, is in the forgotten places, and the places no one's really paying attention to, and the places that can't really get taken away, right? Because at the end of the day, I will always have that. Like I'll
Yeah.
always have the ability to connect with a voice that's willing to be vulnerable and open. Then there's always hope,
Yeah.
Then there's no all that's hard, all that's difficult, all that becomes messy is trying to figure out how do we keep doing that? How do we keep
Yeah.
doing that in a way that's healthy, in a way that is consistent? But at the end of the day, like experiencing it, it's it's something no one can take from you. And it's something even in the midst of the most hurtful moments and moments of deep betrayal and disappointment, those never get washed away.
Mm.
And those have always been the foundation for so much of my love for this work, for community, for relationships, for God in the midst of those relationships. It was formed in the spaces and places that I knew the rest of the church and the leaders of the church didn't really give one
Yeah.
bleep about. Uh,
Yeah.
but they became everything to me. And because that was the only place I was allowed to minister, right? That was the only place that I was going to get to be the fullness of myself. And I try to be very careful with my wording because you will never catch me saying, I'm so glad it all happened, because
Mhm.
I'm not.
Mhm.
There's
Mhm.
plenty of experiences in the midst of that I could have done without, and I don't think God needed to get me here. But in the same vein, like that is what formed me as a minister. Those conversations in those places formed my love of the church. And for
Yeah.
that, I am so grateful. And for that is what I give all credit to any good that I do
Yeah.
for the rest of my life is because of what those teenage girls taught me and for what God taught me in the midst of getting to love them and getting to serve them and getting to be committed to them wholeheartedly.
Hmm.
It has changed my definition of hope and what we're even doing this for. Because yeah, like I don't think there's a lot of ministers who would be very optimistic about a church of 11 people
Yeah.
or or a church meeting out of a living room even. Like,
Yeah.
I know that's embarrassing to a whole sector
Yeah.
of pastors and church leaders that would not see that as hopeful, that would not see that as positive. But because of how I was formed as a minister, that's life. Like
Yeah.
that's my treasure. Like that's everything. And so it's really easy to be positive about those things because I really mean it when I say like it is my fullness of joy uh to get to minister in spaces like this. And so
Hmm.
yeah.
I didn't expect to have a very strong emotional reaction to that first question, to your answer to that first question. And maybe not all listeners will, maybe not all listeners feel this, but I think maybe as a dad of a 15-year-old and 13-year-old girl, uh, B, somebody who gets to spend time with a lot of their friends. I coach youth sports teams for both of the kids and just get to hang out with their friends a lot. And I don't know, the way you just described you being sort of put over in a corner of
Mhm.
a faith community and the only place where you'd be allowed to have a voice or any influence with a bunch of teenage girls. And why don't you just take these teenage girls over here and you can just manage this. We'll do the important stuff in the rest of the building as a metaphor. I don't want to put those words in your mouth or make it that's your story, but that is such a visceral image that you painted, Nicole. Like, and one that had, as somebody who knows a whole lot of teenage girls and gets to be a part of their life in any way, but gets to be a part of their life where I talk about important parts of being human and I get to listen to them and I get to watch them. Of course, that made you optimistic despite the
Mhm.
fact that you were in that corner. Of course, it did. They're beautiful,
You were
beautiful
having the best
souls. I'm
time.
sure you were. And probably talking about the most human, most real aspects of real life. I just, that painting, that image for me of you in the corner with teenage girls as though it was just set aside, as though it was less important, and knowing that there is nothing more real than those conversations. There's nothing more sacred that I've been invited into in my life, I don't think, than those little moments where they're real with each other and they include me in it. What a gift. What a gift. I'm just I'll stop talking, but I just wanted to say that was beautiful. That was beautiful.
Please don't stop. I miss that environment constantly.
Yeah.
And again, like I love adults. It's a whole different ball game, like getting
Yeah.
to pastor and shepherd their souls. But again, I mean, so much of how I even learned how to do that, how to have a certain level of compassion and empathy and patience is yeah, talking to girls through their first heartbreak
Yeah.
and best friend betrayals. And those are the things that get so belittled in
Yeah.
church spaces and so overlooked or seen as non-important and to have gotten to be one of the few people that just got to exist in that space and say this is crushing your world right
Yeah.
now and
Yeah.
so you better be sure that this is important, this is worthy of a 2-hour conversation, like
Yeah.
at the very least this is
Yeah.
worthy of sympathetic tears and holding your hand and treating it like the travesty that it feels like for
Yeah.
you because it does. It
Yes.
feels like the end of your world right now. And you don't need a lecture on it's not that big a deal or you'll move on or, XYZ. Um,
Hmm.
and I think getting to not fast forward through those experiences and not belittle them and see them as significant, that's that is where I think God did some of the best work in my
Yeah.
own heart, in my own soul, is through those relationships. So yes and amen. And I actually did
Mhm.
not know you had teenage girls. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That makes me even more happy to talk about it with you.
So I want to stay in this particular theme right now. I read a post or an article. I don't know where I read this, but it was something that you created, something that you wrote once, and it said this. I'm gonna quote it. You wrote, "I once believed my calling in life was to be the woman in complementarian spaces who could endure the worst of the sexism and cruelty to see it through to the other side." To be the one that helped them learn to value women and to celebrate women's worth fully. My entire ministry and worth revolved around being not just a woman, but being the woman who could finally break through the mold, no matter what it cost her. That last line, no matter what it cost her. That whole thing's pretty heavy, Nicole. If you are all right, I'd love to have you talk about that. And I wonder what you would say to other women out there right now who might be carrying around a weight that feels kind of similar.
Yeah. First of all, I gotta again just thank you for your choice of wording there. To see that statement and that sentiment as heavy, when you kind of sent some of the questions you're going to ask, and
Mm-hmm.
I read that one, I just stopped at that word
Mm-hmm.
and realized I don't think I ever really allowed myself to acknowledge how heavy that was and how burdensome that sentiment was, because I think to be in it and to be in that environment, it's almost just a given. Like, it's sort of an expectation.
Mm-hmm.
And granted, like there are definitely a handful of a great grouping of women in complementarian spaces that see no issue with
Mm-hmm.
any of it, with
Mm-hmm.
the implications of it, with the limitations that, certain churches draw, because they're literally all different. Like, depends on the day and the season and the mood of the lead pastor, like what that limitation is going to be, where they're going to draw the line. And some women are perfectly okay with that,
Mm-hmm.
and exist in that space fully, not really desiring or requiring change. But there's also a great sector of women who agree with the interpretation, who are committed to that theology, who believe it is a faithful reading of those passages of scripture, but still long for a better outworking of those interpretations, a better honoring of women, even in the midst of refusing them certain titles. Because a lot of those women don't even want those titles.
Yeah.
They just want to not be treated like garbage.
Yeah.
They just want to, heck, even freely minister to the women that they love,
Yeah.
and are facing backlash in that and are facing restriction in that. Heck, want to minister to 17 and 18-year-old boys and it
Mm-hmm.
not make a difference the month that it's their birthday. Like,
Yeah.
we're not talking about taking over pulpits here. We're talking about very minimal desires for change and desires for, hey, can we look at this again? Can we readdress this, reassess it? And for those women who simply long for, hey, this could be better, it is certainly expected of them that that's on them to carry.
Mm-hmm.
And that's on them to educate every man around them. Because let's be real, they're either the sole voice or one of two.
Yeah.
Having to educate staffs of 10 plus men,
Yeah.
who all either are or pretend that they are more educated than these women, who have, because of patriarchy and because of complementarian limitations, will always have significantly more experience. And so we'll always look down on your opinion, and we'll always treat it as less than. We'll always assume that while you are a woman in ministry, somehow them having read 2 articles on the topic means they instantly know more about it than you,
Mm-hmm.
when you have read literally every book that's ever been written about it and have cried more tears over those passages than any other passage in scripture. And so for these women, it is very much just this given expectation that very rarely is even given voice to, that if you want even the most minimal changes, it's on you to convince everyone, to get everyone on board. Not only that, but to endure whatever is in
Mm-hmm.
the culture and in the hearts of the men around you that's led to those limitations, and that's led to those unfair and unjust restrictions on women. So basically, until you help us all figure it out, you also need to bear the burden of us not figuring it out. And what that's done to our culture and what that's done to the hearts of our men for years. That's all on you.
Yeah.
That is heavy. And it really didn't hit me until you used that word in the
Mm.
description of that question, of how heavy that was and how impossible of an expectation that is for these women, and how deeply unfair it is. And how oftentimes it would even be acknowledged. I remember a former boss of mine, he constantly told me how I was the hinge, right? Like, if I don't, he would use some door metaphor, and listen, this man liked to talk, so half of it like just went right over my head. I just remember that hinge like
Mm.
metaphor he constantly talked about. We're all hinged on me, and obviously, like when
Mm.
everything hinges on that one point, it's going to be really heavy, and it's going to be, this really intense burden. And so he would say that, but then, when I would actually come and be honest of like, hey, yeah, this is getting very heavy. I'm not okay. Hey, this is really heavy. I need some support. Oh, well, then at that point, you're just being really negative. Like,
Mm.
I don't think that's that big of a deal. I don't know what you're talking about. Or you just need to be more patient. You just need to be more gracious. I think you're just not recognizing how much we're actually doing for you,
Mm.
like, and so even when there was some sort of acknowledgement, it still wasn't this soul level, hey, we recognize how heavy and how unfair of a burden this is on you.
Yeah.
How can we surround you and help you in that? It was, yeah, this is going to be a heavy burden on you. Good luck, champ. You got it.
Mm.
And I did not, in fact, have it. And I don't think any woman should have to have that. And that I think would be my, I don't know, message. I don't want to say encouragement. I don't know, even know if it's encouraging, but to women maybe still in that space, very much believing that to be their role. And maybe they wouldn't voice it that intensely. Maybe they
Mhm.
don't think it's that bad yet. Maybe they don't see it as solely on them, and they think they have a great male advocate and they're not alone in that. I certainly hope that's the case, but I think something I wish I would have considered a bit more in the midst of that is it's kind of like you said, that last sentence of, no matter what it cost me.
Mm.
I think we as women in that space are deeply dishonest with ourselves about how much it is actually costing us.
Mm.
And I think when you're in it and you're in it for a very long time, it becomes really hard to recognize just how much damage is being done until you're out of it. And that's when all of it comes like crashing in. And heck, that's, I mean, been my journey for the last 2 years being outside of that space is not even the overt spiritual abuse and manipulation and bullying that I received toward the end, but even just the lot of years of subtle teachings and behavior and postures toward me that made me feel less than, and
Yeah.
and made me feel a certain way approaching the throne of God, and made me feel a certain way enduring encouragements of God, and how I even listen to his voice and how I follow his promptings. Like, all of that was just in a mess
Mm.
in the aftermath of coming out of those spaces. And I think only then is when I really sat with all that it actually cost me.
Yeah.
And so I think for those women in those spaces, like, man, I want them to consider themselves worthy enough to be able to draw a line and say, this is no longer worth it. That this is costing me too much. And to recognize that that's not a selfish statement. That's not an unloving statement. That to be in those spaces and be expected to carry a burden like that is what is deeply unfair and selfish and unloving. And sometimes, especially in those spaces where we are so easily forgotten, I think we have to choose to love ourselves because no one else is going to in
Mm.
that way, to say no more. This is doing more damage to me than it's worth. And I think by the time we actually feel like maybe we should be considering, is that my reality? We're probably past the point
Yeah.
that that is the reality. And, I say that as someone who I had to get fired. Like I didn't
Yeah.
choose to leave. Like I was like you read, I was in. I
Yeah.
was gonna go down with that ship. And it wasn't until they said, no, thank you, we're
Mm.
done with you, that I was really able to leave. So I say all of that carrying that recognition of I get how impossible it feels
Mm.
to walk away from those spaces that you feel so committed and invested in and that you love so deeply. And that's the thing. You're never just leaving a job. You're not just leaving, heck, even your friends. You're leaving those teenage girls.
Yeah.
You are leaving leaders that you poured into and invested in who as soon as you are gone are not going to have an advocate in the same way anymore. Like there's so
Yeah.
many levels to that. But
Well,
I think
that's where my head is right now, like, or my heart is feeling for you is the slingshot moment of, all right, so it's time to, you're shown the door from that space. It's not like you walked into, and it's not like you walked out the door and suddenly the world was bright and sunny. I would guess it was like,
oh, yeah.
oh, look at what I've been. Oh, everything's good now. That no, there's all this latent baggage and pain and just probably just sorrow and mourning that you bring with you because those are real people, real relationships, a real big part of your life that was so important. And you look outside and say, I want to create something different. And I want to get into this in a second, like what you're doing now, because that's really the reason that I asked you on here. But this part of your story, I think, is so in varying levels, so real for so many women, in such a wide range of denominational faith experiences. I mean, not just not even just complementarian spaces. I think about uh, senior pastors. There's a woman who just got hired to be a senior pastor at a local church nearby. It's a church that I partner with a little bit. And I think maybe leading into this call, I started really reflecting on, hang on a second, like how many other senior pastors do I know, even in this really progressive, really liberal uh, denomination? And I have a hard time counting more than three. I mean, Nicole, like that for real. And then I'm like, well, wait a second. And what a difficult experience that must be. And that's at this far other range of the spectrum of the faith tradition, right? So it's not like you walked out the door and it was like, oh, sparkles and glitter, and this is easy. Let's go. That right. Anyway, I don't want to make assumptions there, but I'm curious about that transition moment.
No, and well, and honestly, thank you for speaking to that because that is probably to this day been the hardest thing for me to process and sit with is even coming out of that and kind of very much, yes, like slingshotting to the other extreme, just like went fully like full egalitarian,
Yeah.
much more progressive theology, like kind of entered into those spaces. Um, what what became hard there was I don't think a lot of people understood that then massive part of my life.
Mm-hmm.
Especially like starting to meet with a lot more female pastors and female ministers who existed in egalitarian spaces for a long time. To your point, like they certainly experienced multiple levels of sexism, even in those
Yeah.
spaces. But to then sit with me, this woman who was committed to, in their minds, like the worst of the worst for 7 years, I
Yeah.
think a lot of them had a really hard time empathizing with that
Mm,
and understanding, like, why would you stay? Like, why would you ever put up with that? For most of these ones, they were there like a year tops. And then we're
sure.
like, okay, I'm clearly not gonna be able to do what I want to do here, so I'm gonna leave. And so that being such a large chunk, and like I said earlier, like that shaped and formed me as a minister. So that's not something I'm ever gonna not talk about,
Right.
was time in that space. It has also been incredibly hard to come out of that and realize, heck, even now ministering to largely like de-churched or unchurched
Yeah.
or freshly churched people, the stories I tell, they are just like, what? Like, I
Yeah.
have no idea that these spaces existed. And so while I love that, I love that they have never known spaces like that. It is hard to feel seen and wholly understood in some of that, because it is just this very rare middle ground to be in, having been so invested in that space for a long time and now being out of it. I think it's hard to find groupings of people that really understand
Yeah.
like how much you loved and do still love a lot of people in those spaces, and
Yeah.
will never just see them as, sexist monsters.
Mm.
Have no issue identifying where sexism exists in those spaces, but to acknowledge like the humanity of that
Yeah.
and the man, this is what they knew, this is what I knew.
Mm.
To see the relationships in those spaces that are not nothing, and again form you as a human and as a minister, like all of that is heck yeah, I'm only 2 years out, I'm still very
Sure.
much in the
Sure.
grieving process of all that.
Yeah.
um
Well,
and
I
yeah,
think
it's
that also speaks to this whole show, this whole podcast is, very much about the sacredness of relationship, the sacredness of the space between us. And I think there's power in naming the imperfection of that sacredness, the without forgiving it or without excusing it, just naming it and saying it can be sacred. It was for you. It was a big part of your life, that those relationships, and probably still are to some extent, a big, important, sacred moments, sacred, real people in your life. That space was sacred and imperfect,
yeah.
period. And that has to be true, that both of those things are coexisting.
Yeah. Well, and heck, to wrap a whole bow on these first two
Mhm.
questions, I think that's a lot of where my hope and optimism comes from too, is
Yeah.
is the ability to hold that tension, and I think just very early on committing within my own heart, like I want to be okay with this tension no matter how painful it is, that I cannot hate these people.
Yeah.
Like I can't, like I trust me, there are days I'm like that would be so much easier. Can I just be really pissed
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
and be filled with nothing but anger? I've tried. It doesn't work.
Mm.
uh, I loved them too deeply. And that's something like I don't want to ever regret. Uh, and that I don't regret. And,
Yeah.
and I think that has been in large part why I've healed the way that I have, and why that hope still remains is, man, if you can look at the people that have hurt you the worst and have caused the most pain in your life and say, I will always have a love for these people because of the impact they had on me and because of who they formed me to be,
Yeah.
like, then there's a lot, there's a lot of pain that I can withstand, and there's a
Yeah.
lot of pain that I can endure when at the end of the day, it it can't erase that love. It really does make you a lot more positive and optimistic about the power of that love and
Yeah.
being able to build better things from that love, and heck, get to know like whether or not they ever want to be part of it again,
Yeah.
they were part of it being formed. And heck, I mean that's why I still believe in Jesus and the
Yeah.
resurrection, and the power of that is, as I have seen with my own eyes, my life is a living testament to making holy, beautiful, divine things out of death and
Yeah.
out of loss and out of some of the worst moments of grief and pain. And that is something I think only love can do. And so I will always be grateful for the love that I had in those spaces, and heck, for the love that I experienced in those places.
Yeah.
Because like you said, it's a both and. They
Yeah.
loved me and they hurt me.
Yeah.
And I think to live in that tension is the only way to hope,
Yeah.
and yeah,
Mm.
for the good.
Nicole, I want to turn our conversation to some really practical, a whole different style
Let's
of
do
conversation.
it.
But as we do, I want to, I just want to, I think I just want to breathe for a second, and I just want to honor. You didn't have to share this. But I didn't mean to walk us down a path that was um, maybe as raw as I think that is, and beautiful as it was. And I just really, really appreciate that segment of our conversation, Nicole. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Matt. And please don't apologize. This is the path that I love
Yeah.
in conversations, the
Yeah.
only one I know.
Yeah. I want to get into two really practical topics: church planting which you are doing, have been doing in kind of a cool way. I think a cool way, a way
Hey,
that I'm
thanks
really
for that
fascinated by. Yeah,
adjective.
yeah. And secondly, non-traditional styles of faith communities. So you've gathered a non-Sunday-centric, sort of non-event centric community. Um, and so that's what you're doing right now. And I mean, I think it would help to start from scratch on any of these things to explain to listeners what you're doing, who it is, what it's about. Can you describe how you started your current church and maybe how that might differ from other types of church planting too? I think that's probably important to differentiate. All right, I'll get out of the way. Teach us what you're doing, because everything I've seen about it is just straight up cool.
Awesome. I'm gonna do my best because,
Mhm.
like I said, it's weird. So
Cool.
hopefully I can make it make sense. But yeah, so I actually, even how I started kind of came out. I was working for a church plant at the time.
Oh, okay.
First started dreaming about all this, and it was very much a traditional church plant, in the sense of, we starting a Sunday morning gathering, trying to find a worship leader, children's pastor. We used a YMCA on Sunday mornings. So, there's always kind of that building that you're searching for early on in these church plants. So those are kind of the typical things that then when me and the lead pastor of that plant started having conversations about me potentially planting a church at some point, that's sort of the initial conversations that start happening is, okay, location wise, where would you want to do that? Are there buildings in that location that we can start scouting? What is worship going to look like? Who's going to do the kids ministry? Like that's just sort of the big three
Yeah.
that you really start to focus around when it is sort of the idea of church, and planting a church is very much built around planting and implementing a new Sunday morning gathering and
Hmm.
Sunday morning experience.
Hey,
However,
can I pause you right there? Like, can
or
we live in that little
that's
segment of your life? Um, Teach me. I've got a couple really practical questions because I've spent my whole career focused on growing groups, all
mhm,
sorts of groups, almost all secular in nature, not all, but almost all. And I know how to recruit people into a group, but
mm,
it's hard. I mean, it's really hard. And I
yeah,
think there's another layer. I think I've gotten answers from people who've done church plants before when I've asked this question. And often their answers are, well, you just pray and God will send you the right people. And I was like, no, that's not, no, I don't think so. Like, I've been praying for a long time. Like, this is hard. It's hard work to go find people, to invite people, and to do so in a way that is clear about your intention and is clear about the style of church and the type of faith and the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So can you give us some like practical, like, when you were helping with that church plant, how did you find people? Actual people? What did you do? How did it work?
yeah. So with that church plant specifically, a lot of that congregation came from just personal relationship and knowing of that lead pastor.
Okay.
So, and even he like had worked at another church plant before that
Hmm.
planted them. Very big about churches planting churches, right?
Hmm.
So a lot of those people had come from that church as well. So and honestly, even knowing some other guys doing the more traditional route of church planting, that's a lot of it
Yeah.
is essentially recycling people from previous church or sister churches to that previous church.
Hmm.
So it's
Hmm.
it's a lot of kind of just intermixed
Yeah.
church
It's
people belonging.
more of a new branch growing out than it
Yes.
is a whole new
Then it's,
cultivating an
receiving
empty
new
field, right?
people,
Yeah. Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
or reaching out to these neighborhoods that we're actually saying that we're doing this for.
Hmm.
That's a whole other thing. So,
Hmm.
so that's a lot of what I've seen in traditional spaces. And then I will say, like with that church plant, we were, fully affirming, and that's very rare.
Hmm.
And so I think that was also a big,
Yeah.
selling point to people is this is an affirming church, and people of the LGBTQ plus community can come and worship and experience God and community together. That's an amazing selling point.
Hmm.
And so I would say those two, if you're asking someone on a Sunday morning who's there for the first time, how did you find us?
Yeah.
Those were going to be one of the two answers. And again, they were also very much attached to another pretty big church in Austin, who again was kind of known for the same vibe, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah.
And so, but again, it's kind of, so once they moved from Austin to here, they visited us, or friend of a friend. And so it's all very much like who you know and what previous churches you're attached to. That is kind of where I think a lot of that typical recruiting comes from.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That's helpful. Okay. Go. All right. So sorry. I wanted to pause there for a minute just because what you're doing now is really different than that. Yeah. I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
really dramatically different than that. Yeah.
Oh yeah. um yeah, so early on in those conversations, I I had started, and really from the beginning of even working in that church plant, had been going through my own wrestling of, yeah, like, what are we doing here? What's the point of this? Is this working?
Mhm.
What's success? You know, like in terms of, hey, we know we're doing good as a church. Like,
Yeah.
how do we answer that question? And especially as a church plant, right, where that's so much of those early days is like, is this working? Is this going well? Like, how are we answering these questions? And just sort of wrestling with, I think the way that we answer them, again, especially in traditional church plant settings, isn't great.
Mhm.
Isn't super encouraging. Like
Yeah.
it's very numbers based. It's very much how many baptisms are we getting in, and how many seats are we, filling, and understandably so. Like
Yeah.
again, when all of it is revolving around this Sunday morning experience, you want to fill the room, and you want to be able to tell your funders that you're saving souls, and we represent that through baptism, even though we don't believe that saves souls
Right.
for some weird reason. Uh, and working in that space for a bit, I became again the annoying negative voice of like, hey, that's great, we're baptizing people, but like, are we are we taking care of them after that?
Mhm.
So like, what do they do next? Like, what's okay, what does that mean? Like,
Mhm.
and I get it when you're in that mode of like, I just need to deliver numbers to these people that are giving us thousands of dollars so that we can make rent. The annoying voice that's like, but what about, like,
Mhm.
that's super irritating. I get that. But that's also where then I started to experience a lot of discomfort of like, well, then what are we doing?
Mhm.
Like if we feel so beholden to this way of planting and to funders and to making rent that we can't even ask and really sit in very basic, like, this is what the church should care about questions,
Yeah.
and we're doing that from day one. Like, I think that's another thing, having worked for churches that were anywhere from like 7 to 70 years old.
Mhm.
A lot of this stuff gets explained away by just culture. And
Yep.
oh, it's just kind of how we do things. It takes a while to change that. You just got to be patient. But here I was seeing, no, that's how we start doing things. Like that is how it is day one. Of course, 7 to 70 years down the road, we have at no point learned how
Yeah.
to reorient our attention and our care toward things that are not going to produce growth necessarily in numbers,
Mhm.
that are not necessarily going to produce a bunch more baptisms. Um, and so I'm internally wrestling with a lot of this stuff, and that's kind of where I started looking elsewhere, just outside of, traditional networks and denominations, somewhat inside, if they met my quota of like trying to find places that were having these conversations about beyond Sunday morning,
Yeah.
and what does it look like to equip people beyond Sunday morning, and is Sunday morning even working, and what is the point of a sermon, and that being the center of our time together, at least in evangelical spaces, right? And all that type of stuff. And so it was in my listening to those voices and sort of just starting to pay attention to those voices that I ended up finding the organization that I'm currently getting trained through. And so they're called V3, the V3 movement. And they were very much about, grassroots, non-Sunday-centric, non-program-centric church planting. And that sold me pretty much instantly. When
Yeah.
I heard those phrases together, I was like, I'm in, tell me
Yeah.
more. And the more they told, the more I was like, man, this has been so much of my heartbeat within ministry for so long. Just this emphasis on discipleship, this emphasis on equipping every saint and every believer to do the work of ministry where they are and in their neighborhoods and in their networks. And the amazing thing about this organization was they weren't just theorizing about that or saying like, that's what we should aim for. It was like, no, we so deeply believe that this is what church is about. We're going to completely redo church to actually make this the center of what we're doing.
Mhm.
And we're not just going to constantly try and push discipleship into this program Sunday-centric model that does not foster discipleship. Like, I don't know how many experiences we have to go through before we learn that lesson. No part of what we're doing is actually building disciples. It is not even, fruitful or flattering toward the process of making a disciple. And I think most pastors would even acknowledge that. Yet we keep trying to force it in, and we keep trying to just make it happen. And what I loved about this network was like, no, we got to reorient the whole thing. Like we gotta set up some new structures, some new systems, some new ways of operating if we actually want to do this well.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what sold me on them, and had me pretty much sold on committing to building something from the ground up that was going to look very different and was going to be non-Sunday centric and far more centered on the discipleship and equipping of a small group of people, and allowing a church to sort of be formed around that and around them and around what God is already doing in their lives and where they already exist, rather than calling them away into something else that they kind of attend and then leave, and then maybe invite people from their existing spaces like into that space that's actually not really for those people. So that's actually super uncomfortable. Why would we do that? Like, there's a lot in there. But yeah, so that's kind of what that process was like. And then even now, as we are getting it off the ground, we're sort of, again, turning that whole cycle on its head, where in traditional church planting, your focus is going to be that bigger space of kind of public gathering, hoping those smaller groups or small spaces or smaller discipleship will kind of pop up out of that. For us, we're sort of doing that in reverse and saying, no, let's focus in on that discipleship, focus in on those core relationships, on this small group of people, and then allow that to flourish into, to help create, to help make some more public spaces that are actually welcoming and for the benefit of those outside of our, quote, church.
Okay. So if I bump into you in Houston and we just have a nice coffee shop conversation and we're just chit-chatting and we just met, and you say you're doing this thing, and I'm like, whoa, oh, I'm actually looking for a new faith experience. Actually, I haven't been to church in a long time. I kind of had not a great experience, when I was younger, and just haven't found a church home. And honestly, my weekends are booked anyway because I got softball tournaments and soccer tournaments with my kids. And like, so, give me the elevator pitch of this is what it is to first time, first. I'm curious. I mean, what is it that you're doing?
Yeah. So usually my pitch, I use what we call the 4 spaces of belonging, which is actually a sociological principle about how we relate to one another and how we exist in human connection. And the fact that there are different modes of that are largely based off how many people occupy that space. And what I love about these spaces of belonging is that they're each important, they each matter, they each have pros and cons, but they each serve different needs. So biggest space is going to be that public space, right? 70 plus people, where if you're existing in that space, you probably don't have personal relationship with everybody there. You're not on a first name basis, but you are all for some reason gathered in that setting for a specific purpose, be it church or PEC school or a coffee shop, something like that. Then you come into a closer space being social space. So this can be anywhere from 25 to 70 people. So this is like, heck, a private school, a smaller church, a neighborhood, a working environment where you're probably on a first name basis with everybody and maybe know some like fun facts about everyone there. But you're not necessarily like in personal relationship with everybody, knowing deep things about one another. And then smaller space into that is personal space. So that's going to be your 8 to 12. These are people you have in some way a relationship with. You are connected by something probably bigger than you, again, whether that be friendship or a mission, something you're trying to do together, accomplish together. A sports team like would be a good example of that. And then finally, your most inner space is going to be your intimate space, the 2 to 4 people that know the fullness of who you are, like mess and all, mask off. They know everything about you. And so what we are doing is really creating and centering around that personal space, that 8 to 12, wholly believing that this is what Jesus modeled for us. That is the prime space for the most growth, the most accountability, the most trust and vulnerability that you can really operate in a way that's practical and helpful beyond needing to be like your ugliest, most messy self, which I had to learn the hard way of like, hey, you don't actually have to tell your deepest, darkest secrets to everybody. But you can be vulnerable, right? With a bigger grouping of people, with boundaries and understanding some of those parameters as well. So in committing to this 8 to 12 personal space of people, what that then becomes is our church, that then is being motivated and equipped and encouraged to exist as the church in a greater social space.
Mm.
So rather than that social space of 25 to 70 being our like Sunday gathering or our church necessarily, it's more of a space and a place that we get to act as the church and be the church and actually do things for our community and for our environments and for the people that we feel called to serve and be the hands and feet of Jesus too, where the worship and the scripture and the prayer, we're doing that as in our personal space, a place that's we can trust each other, we are committed to each other. There's not a bunch of people coming in and out. Like this is a set group of 8 to 12 individuals who have said like we are in this together. And then we're able then to serve in a trusted, secure way a greater community of people who they can come in and out. They don't necessarily have to feel as attached. They don't have to be instantly vulnerable and share the like innards of their soul
Yeah.
on week 1 or week 2. And we actually get to really be the church to those people in a way that's not necessarily inviting them into what we want to do with our worship and our prayer, but we get to take what we're experiencing in those spaces, what we're learning in those spaces, and bring it to the rest of the world in what they want to do and how they are already existing and the human connections that they already have. And so running into someone in a coffee shop that's very curious about, joining or taking part, or what does this look like for me to be involved with? That's sort of kind of a need to differentiate between being associated with our core versus really helping us build out this social space that is designed to be missional. It's designed to not necessarily be just for Christ following Christians, but is a space for literally everyone, and where we can be united and committed to things even beyond just that, but serving our communities and serving our neighborhoods. And that is wholly motivated by this inner core that do feel committed to being Jesus followers with each other. So like even right now, we have a lot of folks who are interested in what we're doing, but like can't necessarily make that commitment to be a part of that core, because it does come with a high commitment to be able to be a place like that has that security and trust. But they're definitely people that we think of as we start to imagine and dream about this social space of, okay, what are the things that we hear they're needing? What
Yeah.
are the things that we're hearing would lead to their goodness and their flourishing? What are the things we're hearing that they would really be served by? Okay, let's us 11 brains get together and start dreaming about how is God asking us to serve that need? How has God equipped us uniquely to serve that need? How can we work together and depend on each other to serve that need and build that place for these other people that very much want to experience community, but maybe aren't ready or don't have the time to be in that level of commitment as the core.
So I'm gonna use really simple words, but there's like the small group essentially. I mean, 8 to 12 is definitional small group from lots of old uh, models, but small groups were always secondary, tertiary experiences or obligations, but they weren't the big show, right?
Right,
like they're we all knew they were important, but they're not the big show. The big show's on Sunday, right? And
right.
when people say I belong to this church, what they mean is Sunday, and also they might do some of these small groups on the side. I think there's variations of that, obviously, but okay. So you've got this small group,
Mhm.
and that is the center. That's to me,
That's
I
the
think
whole thing.
that's the whole thing. That's it. That's the center. And then
Yep.
so this is I think I was learning as you were talking, but I don't think I understood your desire to create that sort of one tier above that, sort of the social space, the whatever, up to however many, but a couple dozen people,
Yeah.
a few dozen people who are maybe they gather, they do something. I think what I hear you saying is that group does something, not just for each other, but maybe for the world around them, and in so doing, for each other. Am I saying that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I will
To
say that's probably the most hazy,
yeah,
just like thing to describe in the midst of what we're doing because we're still forming that.
yeah,
And to me, that's sort of the beauty of what we're doing. Like I'm not coming in telling this group of 11 people, hey, this is the type of social space we're going to try and build. So much of how we answer that question of who are we inviting into that space? Who are we anticipating is going to want to come to that space? What are we going to spend our time doing in that space? It is going to be answered by these 11 people and who they are already attached to, who they already have relationship with, who they already feel the Lord drawing them toward and asking intentional questions about and
cool.
caring about showing up in their lives in meaningful ways. That is not just about their spirituality. That is not just about wanting them to believe in Jesus.
Yeah,
It's going to be about meeting physical needs, meeting economic needs, meeting mental and emotional needs, right? Like we want to care about the wholeness of these people and really leave our hands open to how is God asking us to meet them and be Jesus to them? And where does that make the most sense to happen? Is that a community dinner? Is that going to the brewery that they all already enjoy hanging out in? Is that inviting them, yeah, into something that we build a safe place to, like a church recovery program
yeah.
where we build a safe space for you to just doubt and question and cry and like grieve and we get to be trauma informed individuals that just want to help you heal in that
Mhm.
with no agenda, with no wanting you to come to a certain place, right? Like there's so many different ideas of what this could look like, which again to me is so sweet, is it really gets to be wholly open to who are these people, how has God designed them and equipped them to exist in this world, and where is he drawing them to right now, and how do we as a church get to be about that and
Yeah.
get to honor that and get to follow that lead without feeling like we have to sort of dictate where we're headed just by my own vision or my own ideas. And obviously it's clear I have a lot of my own ideas
Yeah.
of where this could go, but wanting to keep that as open as possible to yeah, these 11 people that I know and love and that I get to see every week, God is clearly doing things in and is drawing people toward. And so now it's just a matter of, okay, how do we honor that? How do we build at least some order around that? But then outside of that, allow it to really be free and organic and about what God's just already doing without us having to orchestrate something for it.
Man, that is, first of all, I'll bet there's a bunch of listeners. I bet there are some listeners who are uncomfortable with the vagueness or
Oh,
the
yeah.
haziness, right? And I'm sure when you're in some conversations with some people, their eyes glaze over and they're like, "Well, this isn't for me. I'm going to need clarity. I'm going to need rules. I'm going to need things to live." And I get that. Not me, Nicole. Sign me the up. I mean, I like that stuff. This idea. I also want to say, and maybe you can speak to this. I saw on your social media you posted a picture of, I don't remember what it was called exactly, but it was like a piece of paper, and it was like the commitment that the
Yeah.
11 of you signed. And I first of all, I thought that was a really cool thing transparently. Like I clicked on it, I zoomed in, I read all the
Okay.
details,
Thought
and
about that.
I
Oh.
was really struck by that, though. A, that you would post it on your social media. B, that the things that you are committing to as a group of 11 people gathering together there was no like, excuse this, anybody listening who doesn't like this, but there was no like Christianese, there was no religious gobbledygook in there. It was like straightforward, practical. These are our promises as humans to each other as we connect together in faith. This is what I'm going to do and what you're going to do, and can we shake hands on it? It was such a practical ritual, such a solid, rooted in a neighborhood, rooted amongst real people. And what you're talking about sounds the same way. There's no abstraction to what you're talking about. You're not starting with the abstract. What if there was a building that housed God and that we might meet God within? You're not starting in the abstract. That's a beautiful vision, but you're not starting there. You're starting with, here's a table, here
Mhm.
are 11 chairs. I'll organize it, but I'm not in charge. Let's do this together. Very practical, very local, very rooted. I just think that's really cool.
Thanks. I appreciate that because yeah, that tends to be the crux of whether
Mm.
someone thinks I'm crazy or not. Uh, and even like the like V3 who I'm getting trained by, that was an early on annoyance that I very much loved, is how little of like practical answers they can give you because they recognize and teach like this is so contextual.
Mhm.
This is wholly going to be based on who you have, on what your city looks like, on where you feel called to in that city. Here are some general like tools, rules of relating, rules of relationship, rules of what does it mean to like look in your community and ask good questions that help you foster an understanding of that community. But how you answer that, what you build out of that, like we can't tell you that. And again, it's so annoying sometimes.
Mm.
But oh my gosh, do I love it because it truly does keep us dependent on the guidance of the Spirit in a way that I've just never experienced in a traditional church. Again, not for lack of trying, but because innately in how it's built, you can't really.
Yeah.
I know there's lots of feelings on this man, but his book Letters to the Church, written by Francis Chan, that
Mhm.
was a pretty big pivotal read for me. I remember him sort of addressing that of like, hey, we can say we're dependent on the Spirit and on God all we want, but at the end of the day, if you can't rely so much on him, that like, what if he wants to guide your church through a massive repentance? And that means he's going to draw out 50% of your congregation. Are you actually willing to lose your building, to lose like literally in some cases millions of
Yeah.
dollars in real estate to let him do that? Come on now. Like no one's going to do that.
Mhm.
We
Mhm.
gotta be honest with ourselves. That is not how committed we are to the Spirit of God.
Mhm.
And so that's what I love so much about this process is it really allows us to actually do that in a way where we're not constantly feeling like we're about to lose everything if we actually follow God where he's asking us to follow. Because at the end of the day, what do we have? We have 11 people who have made relational commitment to each other and who long to better this city. And there are so many ways to do that. There's so much freedom in how we do that. And I did want to add and make clear, because I think that's part of the beauty of it. That document was crafted by our community. So the week before, we had a whole conversation on expectations and what do we need from each other in order to trust each other, in order to feel secure with each other, in order to feel at peace with each other, even in the midst of conflict. And so everything you read in that document were things that they said, that they wrote, that they said very boldly and honestly in front of each other, that then they got to commit to in a way that was like, this is what we want. This is what I
Yeah.
want. This is what I need. And I see that represented here versus a lot of, kind of traditional church commitments that really have nothing to do with the people themselves, but it's far
No,
more about the bigger system and institution that you
that's
are
right.
become a part of. And again, that's one way of doing it. Um, and we get a lot of like, okay, what happens when you don't agree on a theological principle or a certain like doctrine? And again, I think when you're committed more to the relationship and to the journeying through those things together, a lot of that, and I know that this is hard for people to grasp because of our current view of church, but a lot of those other theological doctrinal matters that we feel are so important, like they become so much easier to flesh out when you recognize, like, at the end of the day, what we are most committed to is each other and
Mm.
our mutual being able to journey through this together, not being right, not having to come to one understanding, because let's look at church history for a second. We have never, ever had that.
Yeah.
Let's be very clear. Like, yes, you can quote the creeds at me. Those are great, and we do use them. But at the end of the day, like there has been so much disagreement in terms of the practicalities, the deeper meanings, the
Mm.
certain interpretations, the implications that all those things have on the church and on us as disciples. So how do we build faith communities that actually allow for that openness and allow for that curiosity and allow for the ability to change our minds without meaning we are going to lose community, we are going to lose relationship, and we are going to lose trust and security with each other?
Yeah. When humans choose to just start by, if step one is just start by committing to each other and
Yeah.
believe that God will show up.
Yeah.
Like if a church was built that way, instead of commit to the church and then we'll find each other, like that triangle is a different triangle. The one where we just start by committing to each other, because let's be honest, this is all we're really equipped to do really well, is show up for each other, care for each other first, and let us trust that God will show up. This for me is somewhere in the theology of what between is about, and it makes me long for what you're doing. I mean that very sincerely. You talked about like the commitments that we make to churches, institutional churches. Um, I had somebody call me out the other day because I'm leading this between project, and I'm partnered with the Presbyterian Church in my community. I'm with the like Presbytery, the Denver Presbyterian, and somebody asked me, he was like, "Are you actually a member of your church?" And I was like, "Well, I'm gonna,
The Republican.
yeah, I'm an associate member technically. Let's not look at the paperwork because when they said, "Do you commit to this stuff?" I was like, not all
Yeah.
of it. Honestly, not all of it. No, I've got my no, and but man, like what a thing to gather with the group of people at my church, my local home church, and to look at them in the face and say, "This is what I want to promise to this is what I think we want to build together. Let's talk about it. Let's flesh it out. And let's put it on paper and let's look at each other when we sign it. And let's write our names in different color ink on the bottom of that paper, Nicole. Like what a beautiful symbol that isn't just about what you're doing. It's about how we gather. It's about how we relate to each other. And I believe, Matt Mattson's belief is it's the quickest way to truly invite God into that space is to just look at each other. Just look at each other, and you'll find God. Don't you don't need the building. Uh, we in Luke's gospel, when Jesus sends him out, you don't need special equipment in the Message translation. You don't need special equipment. This isn't about. Don't stay in the fancy hotels. He said, "This is it. This is it right here. This is
Yeah.
us."
Yeah. And to your, I mean, to your point, like I think that has been probably the most healing and beautiful thing of this entire process, almost to the point that it's annoying, is how much God has shown up.
Mm,
Like how I mean, I am at a loss for words sometimes of how much it humbles me of how outright ridiculous some of this has felt. It's like, who do I think I am
sure.
about to start like this whole new thing? And yeah, like trying to convince people to be part of it. I still think they're crazy half the time. I'm like, y'all seriously want to do this? Okay. Like I never want to give off this impression that I am some like holy, faithful, bold, crazy. Like most days, I'm like, this is gonna flop any day now. Like I'm just waiting for it.
Uh-huh.
And the amount of times that God has just shown up and been consistently and constantly
Mm,
like, yes, this is how I've built you to function.
mm,
This is how I've built our relationship. This is how I've asked you to welcome me in, is in these connections, is in these small moments, is in the mundane, is in the silence. Like to see him constantly honor that without like there's no begging. There's no like, God, please, please, please show up. You haven't showed up in the past few weeks and I don't know what to do. It's let's just make a space and trust that he's gonna come. And I kid you not, he has never once not. And I think so much of that is based around this needing to reorient our understanding of what it means for God to show up and what it
mm,
means for him to be present and what it means for him to be active in our lives. Because he is, period. Always. And I think so much of our missing that is in our differing expectations of what that's supposed to look like, of what that's supposed to feel like, of who that's supposed to come from.
mm,
I was even just meeting with a pastor the other day who was kind of wrestling through, again, full circle, the women in ministry
yep.
conversation in his church, and he asked me for prayer of like that he would, hear and believe the voice of God wherever he instructs, and I kind of gently assured him of like, I think God's already
Mm,
speaking through the women that are telling you what's up in the middle of your church. Like he's speaking. Like I don't need to go
yeah.
ask more. Like and so like it's us needing to reorient. Who are we listening to hear the voice of God? Where do we
Mm,
believe that voice is coming from? What do we believe that voice sounds like? And so much of our experience in this plant so far has been trusting this process of, okay, if we get silent, if we listen to each other, if we commit to each other, if we show up for each other, we genuinely believe God is going to come. He has every single time. And again, it's almost annoying at this point because I'm like, really, God? Okay, so we gotta keep doing this then because this is something, and this is you're clearly making it obvious. Like this is how he intended us to exist together. And man, do we make a mess of it. And I have no doubt I will also make a mess of it at some point, and we will
Yeah.
make a mess of it at some
Yeah.
point. Like that is for sure guaranteed.
Yeah.
But what a beautiful thing he's given us these first several months to get a taste of, but come back to this.
No,
Like
so
never
cool.
lose sight of you felt me here.
Mm,
You did. And you didn't have to beg. You didn't have to, cry out with your last breath. Like I came freely and willingly and boldly. So just keep centered on this. Keep coming back to this. Like this is what I've asked you to be about, and this burden is light. You're not miserable. Like it
yeah.
hasn't cost you your entire,
Yeah. Yeah.
sanity, like how I think some of these church planners talk about their churches. I'm
Yeah.
like, are you okay? You're okay. We get to be okay, and we get to be joyful, and we get to be whole, and he still shows up.
Mm,
Um, and I actually think because of those things, because when we are joyful and whole and not just, spiritually bypassing, we're happy all the time, but like we truly believe God wants joy for us and
yeah.
goodness for us. I do believe he shows up in
Yeah.
that. Um, and we just got to recognize it.
There are like 14 other things I had on my list of things that we were going to talk about. And this conversation was absolutely perfect, Nicole. Absolutely
Yay!
perfect and long. This might be the longest episode I ever released. And thanks. So thanks for the time. But this was, I loved every second of this. Thank you so much. Tell people, you got a blog on Substack that I know you write on. I
Yes.
found you on social media. Where, if people want to know more about Nicole Mason, where do they find you?
I am yeah, I'm primarily on Threads is where I probably write most frequently. And I'm also like active on Instagram. It's where I post a lot of like what you said, our commitment got
Mhm.
posted there. Like I share a lot, maybe too much sometimes about our church plant on my personal Instagram. And through both of those, you can find my Substack. It's Lessons from Lydia. That's where I write at least once a week. And where I process out a lot of the stuff that I'm learning, a lot of the things that we're going through, the good and the bad, and just what this process of even healing from complementarian environments as well as building toward new things. It's all kind of there. So yeah, those would kind of be the three I'm most consistent on that you can find me there.
Right. We'll link those in the show notes. Nicole, thank you so much for every single inch of this conversation and for the really innovative and beautiful and God-filled work you're doing down in Houston, Texas. And I feel like when I found you on the internet, I was like, oh, here's somebody who's trying something in a new way, who is pushing an envelope, who is sees herself on the edge of the inside. And I think I'm I'm just so inspired by what you're doing and what you're about and where you've come from and the gift that you're trying to give people in the world, Nicole. I so appreciate you.
Thanks, Matt. Really appreciated this too, and those words.
Hey, thanks to all you betweeners out there for listening to this episode of the Between Podcast. Make sure you visit between.church on the internet to sign up for our mailing list. That's probably the most important thing, our email list. Make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube. You can check out our 5-minute sermons, 5-ish minute sermons that we post every week. Follow us on social media. We got daily prayers. We got all sorts of other content. And join our community fully. We invite everyone. You are welcome here, no matter who you are or where you're from, no matter what you believe or even if you believe, no matter who you love or how you love, no matter what anybody else has ever told you about you. You are welcome and loved and celebrated here at Between. You know, my favorite church is the space between people. Now go with God's love and create the church between.